Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be talking about, oh my goodness, the one and only Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian democracy in America. So let's get started. The election of 1824 is really seen as the final collapse of the Federalist and Republican political framework. So this is the first time that you had no candidate run under a party. So on here, you'll see maybe a couple names that you recognize. First of all, you have John Quincy Adams. He is the son of the second president, founding father, John Adams. You have Andrew Jackson, who we'll be talking about at length. You also have a name that you probably don't recognize. This is William Crawford. He is the Secretary of the Treasury at the time. You also have Henry Clay, which we've talked about as being the great compromiser. This is one of his 5 runs for president. Henry Clay at this time was the Speaker of the House. So whenever the election was over, you see here that the electoral vote is very close. The popular vote, you can see that you have a 43% lead taken by Jackson, followed by John Quincy Adams with 31%, and the other two were pretty far behind. So what ends up happening is Henry Clay, as the Speaker of the House, now had a very interesting position that he was put in. He was, being a candidate himself, he had led some of the very strongest attacks against Jackson. He could not stand John Quincy Adams. And so he could not stand Andrew Jackson, and he actually secures the White House for John Quincy Adams. And so he helped swing the election in the House of Representatives for Adams. And what ends up happening is John Quincy Adams actually gives Henry Clay the job of Secretary of State. And what is interesting about that is this position of Secretary of State is a stepping stone to the presidency for the past 4 presidents. So Jackson and his supporters are very quick to call this the corrupt bargain. And so very quickly afterwards, Jackson and his supporters, they form what's called the Democratic Party to oppose Adams at every turn. And so even right after the election is secured and everything is set in stone, the next election is what Jackson and his supporters are focusing on. And John Quincy Adams actually has to do the exact same. Adams, he was a lot like his father. He would have been so much happier to sit at home and read a book rather than be out in the public. He was an intellectual. Most people who have speculated on, or who have ranked, the intelligence levels of all the presidents, John Quincy Adams is usually number 1, if not the closest. Highly intelligent and intellectual, and he struggled with the presidency. So he is a 1-term president, spoiler alert. The election of 1828 is basically a rematch. And so most states had either reduced or gotten rid of property requirements for voting. So this basically allowed all white males to be able to vote. So you had 3 times more people voted. And so the common people, they backed Andrew Jackson. And so he ended up winning the election. Andrew Jackson was not born into the lap of luxury. He was not born into a political family. And a lot of people, that resonated with them. Andrew Jackson was born in this very rural region. It's called the Waxhaws region. And it's an area that's in modern-day Lancaster, South Carolina. And it's hard to pinpoint the exact location of Jackson's birth because whenever he was born, the entire area was still being settled and surveyed. So he always claimed that he was from South Carolina, but there was actually one of his aunts was present at his birth and said that he was actually born in North Carolina. It was so close to the border there. But he moved to Tennessee as a young man and eventually became a senator from Tennessee. So that is where, like on the PowerPoint right here, It says that he was not from the original 13 colonies, with Tennessee not being one of those original 13 colonies because he moved to Tennessee as a young man. And that's the state he's going to represent as a senator. So back to the election really quickly. This is showing the map here. As you can tell, it is an extremely different scenario. The electoral vote, oh my gosh, landslide. The popular vote, it's not as close as before, but it's not as it doesn't separate them as much as the electoral vote. So you have the Democrat Party had been that oppositional party to John Quincy Adams. And so here you have the National Republicans with Adams. So clearly Jackson won this time around. So Jackson, being a man of the people, he had very interesting inauguration. So they actually invited the general public to the White House, and the crowd was so unruly and large. The only way to get them out of the White House and from being so intoxicated that they would stop inflicting damage upon the White House was to move the barrels of liquor onto the front lawn of the White House so he could escape through a window and not be harmed. Needless to say, nothing like that happened again. So Jackson for the common people, ladies and gentlemen. So Jackson as president, he expands the powers of the presidency, and we will talk about this throughout most of the rest of this video. He is seen as the founder of the Democratic Party, and he leads it. The Democrats in Congress, they would go along with his decisions because they either agreed with it or they feared him. They did not want to mess with him. He was known to be very quick-tempered, and they didn't want to mess with him. So he also would reward his followers with government jobs. We had talked with George Washington about how he would give people jobs based on their fitness or based on merit, whether they were good for the job. Jackson, not so much. He would give his loyal friends or followers jobs, and this was known as the spoils system. And so with this, he's also expanding the power of the presidency. And to tag on to that, he also uses the veto power more than any other president. So you had people that began to think that he was really abusing his power, acting more like if you take a look at this political cartoon, which you're going to be analyzing, acting more like a king. So they would call him King Andrew. Some people, obviously, these would be his critics. His biggest criticism during president is his actions with the Native Americans. So Jackson approves what's called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So although it only gave the right to negotiate their withdrawal from areas east of the Mississippi, and that relocation was supposed to be voluntary, all of the pressure was there to make this inevitable. So it went from being something to where people would volunteer to being required very quickly. This was the end of their rights as natives to live in those areas under their traditional laws. They were forced to assimilate or act more like Caucasian Americans, like kind of form into their culture. So there were 5 major tribes that were affected, and these were known as the 5 civilized tribes. First, you had the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. And you can see those in the map on the top right. And you can see that it spans, there's North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and even over to places like Alabama and such. So there are a lot of motivations behind this for Jackson and the others behind it. The relocation would make room for settlers and for speculators who wanted to make profits off the purchase and sale eventually of the land. So this didn't really hurt Jackson too much politically because his supporters mostly were from the South and the West. Because of the Indian Removal Act, you had the Cherokee Sioux. They sue the state of Georgia. And so here's what happened. The Cherokee Nation, they were threatened by Caucasian Americans who kept what they saw as trespassing and wanting to take their land. So the governor and most of Georgia said that they wanted the Cherokee out. So the Cherokee established themselves as an independent and a sovereign government where they did not have to abide by U.S. rules and such. So the government was not okay with that. He took over their government, redistributed their land. So meanwhile, during this time, there were white missionaries who were actually working with Native American tribes to help defend their land and culture. So Georgia actually ends up passing a law that bans Caucasian Americans from living with Native Americans without special permission from the government. And so there were some rebels who decided to do it anyway. And one of them was Samuel Worcester. This is where you get Worcester. So he was arrested because he did not get that special permission to actually live there. And whenever people would get that special permission, they would have to promise, basically take an oath to uphold the Constitution, and uphold the Constitution of Georgia, and obey the law. So he was convicted and he was supposed to serve 4 years of hard labor. He appealed, and this went all the way to the Supreme Court. So in the end, the Supreme Court says that the government of Georgia was unconstitutional because only the Supreme Court could make treaties and deals with the native tribes. The Supreme Court, they side with Worcester. Think about it this way. The Supreme Court saw Georgia as like an independent nation and that they should be treated like that. And so, we're not passing laws on how Spain or France should live. This is how they saw it. So Georgia ignored the Supreme Court, and Jackson made the Cherokee Nation fall in line with Georgia law or get out. So later on, a group of Cherokee who break off and secretly sign away some of their land, and this is known as the Treaty of New Echota. And this is in exchange for money. And this was a claim to represent all the Cherokee, but really it didn't. So anyway, you have Andrew Jackson, who basically defies the Supreme Court. And there is a supposed quote from Andrew Jackson where he says, and keep in mind, John Marshall is Chief Justice at this point. He said, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. So in 1838, with the approval of Andrew Jackson, you have federal troops come to Georgia and they force the tribes to be removed. And so this is something that Andrew Jackson co-signed, and this is known as the Trail of Tears. As time went on, you have Cherokee that are resisting, and this is about 20,000 Cherokees who marched westward, and you're talking at gunpoint. Nearly a quarter of them died on the way, and the ones that did make it, they had to figure out how to survive in a completely new place they had never been before. And so their tribe, whenever they got there, they were actually divided because of the Treaty of New Echota. Whenever I tell you that this is Andrew Jackson's most controversial act as president, I mean that. Let's talk about nullification, John C. Calhoun, and the Tariff of Abominations. When you hear abomination, you think of the worst things possible, right? We've talked about tariffs before. So tariffs are taxes on imports. South Carolina was trying to deal with low cotton prices and high prices on imported manufactured goods. So here you have states like South Carolina being the leading state complaining about it. They thought that the tariff was unconstitutional. So they were opposed to these protectionist tariffs like we've talked about. You would have imports that were taxed, so you could have American goods that were able to compete with those imports. So South Carolina and other southern states, South Carolina being the number one, They were opposed to these protectionist tariffs because they would have to pay them. The northern states, they liked them, they favored them because they helped strengthen their industrial-based economy. The South felt it was unfair for them to have to pay because it was helping the northern economy more so than theirs. There are those sectionalist tendencies favoring your region's interests over the others instead of the common good. You have Calhoun pictured, who wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And I'm going to actually read a quote from it. He argued that, and this is his quote, the whole system of legislation imposing duties, or those taxes, on imports, not for revenue, but for one branch of industry at the expense of others, is unconstitutional, unequal, oppressive, and calculated to corrupt the public virtue and destroy the liberty of the country. That is how upset they were over this tariff. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. So he argued that a state, when it believed that a federal law was unconstitutional, could nullify the law in that state and not enforce it. So Jackson himself, he had been kind of quiet on how he felt about nullification, believe it or not. But he made it clear eventually that he was against nullification. So he, in the beginning, made an effort to appease the nullifiers by urging a reduction of tariffs. Congress did reduce it, but it was not enough to satisfy South Carolina and the others who were not happy about it. So Calhoun resigned the vice presidency and he took a seat in the Senate and he defended nullification. Jackson sent in the military to enforce the collection of taxes because Calhoun and South Carolina were threatening to nullify the tariff and South Carolina may secede or leave the Union. So he says, oh, absolutely not. Sent in the military. And so whenever this happens, Henry Clay offers a compromise. Now, Jackson and Calhoun got along for a while. Calhoun had been the vice president under John Adams. And then whenever Andrew Jackson was running, he decided to run with the opposite candidate while being the incumbent vice president. So he is jumping ship quite a bit. And I always found this to be very interesting. Later on in life, after Jackson had left the presidency, he was asked if he had any regrets in the last 8 years. And his response was that I didn't shoot Henry Clay and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun. That doesn't tell you how Andrew Jackson felt about John C. Calhoun. I don't know what will. The National Bank was something else that Jackson had a very strong opinion about, and he let you know it. One of his other quotes, he was talking to Martin Van Buren, future president. He said, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." And then 3 days later, he announced his veto of the bank charter. So he felt like others on his side of the aisle that it was an unhealthy link between the wealthy and the government. So he vetoes that bank charter. He withdraws money and puts it into state banks. And these are known as pet banks. So these state banks, they are not good for the economy at this point because they print as much money, because a lot of them were known for printing as much money as possible, and they gave out loans left and right. They would make risky investments and they didn't stabilize the dollar's value. So eventually this does lead to an economic downturn that some people were not expecting. So as we talked about previously, natives struggled and other minorities struggled during Jackson's presidency, during his 8 years. Whenever they were removed from their lands and just basically left there, they had struggled. Women and free African Americans had no voting rights. There were no moves by Jackson to change that. and the slavery issue was ignored. And it was pushed off to be handled by the people that came after him. And you will see a long line of that coming for a while. All right, so after Jackson, we're just going to kind of run through a few presidents really quickly because there's not really too many consequential things that do happen here. Jackson's second vice president, Martin Van Buren, actually wins the next election. He's dealing with the Panic of 1837. This partly because of those pet banks. And it truly hurts his popularity. He was very popular because Jackson had said, hey, you should vote for this guy. And Jackson was very popular on his side of the aisle. But after this economic downturn, people placed a lot of blame on Van Buren. You have another party that's founded and it sticks around for a while. It's the Whig Party. And this is founded by Henry Clay, which is the guy on the bottom left. We've talked about him being the great compromiser. Daniel Webster, we'll talk about him later, and then John Quincy Adams, and it starts to gain a good bit of popularity. You have a Whig candidate who becomes president. We talked about William Henry Harrison and his exploits on the battlefield. He actually gave an inauguration speech so long. He became ill. He died within a short time of being in office, a little over a month. And so his vice president, John Tyler, actually becomes the first vice president to inherit the job. And people gave him an interesting nickname known as his accidency. I'm going to link this YouTube video below. It is the coolest thing. John Tyler actually has a grandson who's still alive, and it explains how that goes. Basically, he married somebody really young when he was really old. But anyways, I'll leave that link down below. You should watch it. It is so interesting. But take a look at that. All right, so that's it for today. Hope you all have a good rest of your day.